Hey, I believe we're live. Another day, another live. Welcome to Ian's room. Now, today's topic, as you can see by the title, is about ego. So, I've named it Code Approach is the final boss of ego death, right? Now, I've turned off the chat for this one, just because I want to really focus on this topic. So, yeah, I want to really dive deep into ego death and my perspective on it. So, without further ado, let's get right into it. So, ego, yeah, I'm sure people have heard about this concept of the ego. And ego, as I would define it, is essentially the idealized version of ourselves that we project onto the world. So, you know, our ego has us believe that we are a certain way or we should look a certain way. Oftentimes it's positive, right? Our ego wants us to look cool, to seem smart, to be attractive, to be interesting to other people. And it exists as this idealized, let's say, identity that interacts with other people, right? Now, ego is a very dangerous issue, or let's say area of, let's say, like just living life, because it's something that we carry around with us, and it largely influences everything we do, like our behavior. And you know, when it came to Code Approach, I personally realized that if I wanted to succeed, then I had to drop my ego and really drop it, right? Because ultimately, if you're too concerned about maintaining your ego, as I once was, then nothing's really going to happen. You're going to be very caught up in trying to look cool, right? Maintaining your ego means making sure that your identity that you've conjured up in your mind, you have to make sure that that ego is maintained by any means necessary, which means that anything that counters or anything that could potentially put your ego in jeopardy, that must be avoided at all costs, because then you're going to feel terrible, right? And so, I realized that with the ego, it's really a case of getting to a point where you're okay looking stupid, where you're okay looking embarrassed or feeling embarrassed, looking awkward, looking weird, and that's essentially the first step I had to overcome to destroying my ego, or at least chipping away at it, because the ego is a very big force. It's like a massive ball, and it's been conditioned and it's been fed throughout pretty much throughout all our lives, right? Like your ego comes, I mean, your ego is developed as soon as you're, in your early years, and it just continues to grow and grow and grow based on experiences, based on what you think you should be, based on what other people say about you, based on all the influences you have when you watch TV, when you're on social media, when you're in class, even as you grow up, when you find yourself in the workplace or at university, your ego is fed certain ideas, certain narratives, and you make all of this personal. And this all shapes your identity. And then now you get to a point where you feel this need to promote, to maintain this ego, this identity, this idealized identity, that is such a core part of who you are. So that's why it's very difficult. Right? That's why it's very difficult to do anything that goes against that. But I very quickly realized, and this was something that I realized when I started getting into philosophy and reading more, let's say, philosophies by guys like Friedrich Nietzsche, and I read his books, and I would basically I got a better idea of what the ego is and how it sort of develops itself. Um, and I once I took a step back and reflected on how my ego might be affecting my behavior, I realized it's preventing me from taking action. So I remember, I mean, away from Code Approach briefly, I remember when I first started going to the gym, and it took a lot of effort, mental effort, to bring myself to actually go to the gym. And I remember I'd been thinking about it for weeks and weeks and weeks, and I just couldn't do it. And the reason why is because my ego was getting in the way, because I was skinny, and I felt like I didn't belong in the gym because of the way I looked, and my ego was too afraid to put myself in that uncomfortable environment, because in my head I believed that other people would start judging me, right? People would look at me and go, this, look at this skinny guy here, he can't even bench the bar properly, his form is terrible. And I had all these racing thoughts, right? Now, like, what is that? Sure, that's insecurity, but if we go a level deeper below the insecurity, what that really is just my ego saying, I'm uncomfortable. I need to look and preserve my certain identity, which is I'm a cool guy, and I'm I'm like a cool guy, and I look okay, and I'm like fine, and my ego didn't want to have its feelings hurt. It didn't want to be put in that spotlight, right? So that's why I avoided it as much as I could. And then at some point, I just decided, you know what, I need to go to the gym, right? I really wanted to go at the time, so I just overcame my ego and put myself out there and risked being judged or ridiculed. Of course, all of this is in my head and that never happened, but the ego will make it seem as real as possible because it's a fear, right? It's a psychological fear. So it feels real even if it isn't the case. And so I think before I started Cold Approach, I want to say the 6 months before I started Cold Approach, which would have been last year, I started doing stuff that challenged my ego, right? And this was pivotal. This was so important. And I'm so glad I did it because it really primed me to to get into Code Approach and to start it solo. So the first one is improv. So when I started improv, I mean I remember walking up to the class in North London. I remember this, and I thought to myself, what have I signed up for? Because this is going to be awkward and weird. I'm like this, I've got this career, like why am I even doing this? And I knew why I wanted to do it, right? I wanted to get to a point where I didn't really take myself too seriously. And I found it on a podcast, and somebody recommended it as a great way to improve your, let's say, social skills, and to get out of your head if you're someone who's an overthinker, somebody who's very logical. And I fit that bill perfectly. So it just made sense to try something like improv that would have completely shattered my ego, because at that point I kind of sort of saw myself as this clean cut corporate guy who is fairly serious, can have banter with his friends, but at the end of the day, like I have this image that I sort of portrayed to the outside world. And improv comedy was the furthest thing away from that. And then of course there's the added element of looking stupid, right? Because improv is very playful, and you have to really drop all ideas from your head and just go with the flow. And you know, essentially, like I thought to myself, I'm too cool for this. Like I shouldn't be doing this. And so when I got to the class, I was terrified, right? And I'm around all these like even act people who wanted to be comedians and actors, and I didn't see myself as the funniest guy in the room when I first started. But then very quickly in improv class, one of the main lessons they teach you is in this environment, we celebrate failure. Like it doesn't matter, there are no rules. You just get to be like as expressive as you want, and they allow you to just essentially just express yourself. And this was really great. This was a great lesson because it taught me that it's okay to look stupid. It's okay to look weird. It's okay to come across as ridiculous, right? And it was so exaggerated, right? We'd all do all these crazy exercises and these different scenes, and they'll tell me to be this person and that person, and you have your partner. And over time, you just become acclimatized to being silly in front of all these people. And remember, like, we're adults, right? There were guys in there who were my age, a little bit younger, a little bit older. But the point is, all of us, when we entered that improv class in that room, we all just let go of our egos. Any idea of ourselves that we had, it was just left at the door. And once you entered, it was just free for all, go crazy, be childish, do whatever you want. And that was a really big lesson because now I couldn't take myself as seriously because the ego wants to take itself so seriously. But in improv, that doesn't work because if you do that, then you're not allowing your brain to come up with these really funny, wacky ideas or characters when you're in an improv scene. And so that was a great lesson. That was a great lesson for me for sure. And then after that, I started going to these meetup events. So if you don't know, there's an app called Meetup, and I at the time I wanted to make more friends locally because a lot of my friends live in London and I didn't see them that often. And so I wanted to make more friends who were more local in my area, in my sort of small town, which is outside of London. And you know, at some point, my ego, again, it didn't want to admit that I felt lonely at the time and that I needed to sort of brush up on my social skills because before I considered going for these events, I'd spent less time socializing, going out to events, and I knew that I needed to get myself back into that flow after spending a lot of time by myself. So but at the same time my ego was like I don't want to admit that I'm kind of feeling a bit lonely, and I feel like if I go to these events then it means that I'm somebody who's something's clearly wrong with me. People would think something's wrong with me because I'm going to a stranger meetup to meet other people, and like I kind of felt as if that might make me look a certain way, like it might make me look like a loser because oh, this guy needs to go to a meetup event to find new friends. And it's like that's the conversations I was having with myself, right? And when I look back, of course that was my ego, right? Trying to preserve this like false idealized identity that I don't need more friends, I don't need to socialize, I'm cool, I'm fine by myself, right? And so thankfully again I got over it and I went to these events and I made new friends, and I made really good connections, and there's guys that I met in those events that I still talk to now. So it paid off, right? But again, my ego had to take a step back and allow me to really go forward and test myself in this uncomfortable situation because it was uncomfortable, right? Like you go to these events and you have to make up conversation with people. And I already made a live stream yesterday about being introverted. Like that's not my natural state. That's not my natural way of socializing. So to put myself in those situations was hard, but I did it anyway, right? And then after that, I then started going to these dating events, right? Like a singles event. So I only went to one, to be fair. But again, my ego was like, do we need to do this? Like if I go to this event, then I'm basically admitting that my dating life needs work and that I can't meet girls in other places. And so a part of my ego felt as if, you know, if I'm going for this event, then that must mean that something's wrong with me, or I'm too, like I'm not cool enough to meet people in most like normal settings. And I'd have to, like there was a lot of shame attached to it, right? Because I would never tell anybody that I went to a dating event, right? I would just keep it to myself. I wouldn't tell my friends about it. And again, that's me trying to preserve this idea that I already get girls, that I'm already cool, that I don't need to go to the, it kind of feels like a last resort solution. It's like, oh, people might think that I'm desperate because I have to succumb to a dating event. But again, the reality is it was necessary and it was a good decision because I wanted that practice. I wanted to put myself out there in any way possible. So again, my ego was trying to tell me all these other negative, um, let's say, like trying to extrapolate all this other negative stuff from going for this event in order to protect itself, right? Because again, I had this idealized image that I'm a cool, smooth guy who's already fine and doesn't need help or doesn't need to improve this area of his life. But again, I'm thankful that I actually went out and put myself out there. So I'm really happy I did that. Um, and so yeah, of course, this was all happening month by month. And then of course I came across Code Approach, right? And Code Approach was was insane, right? Because with Code Approach, like this is like the ultimate ego death activity, right? Because like I said before, right? The ego is like an idealized version that we project onto the world, right? So, what do I mean by that? Well, we look at ourselves, or our ego looks at itself and thinks, I'm cool, I'm smart, I'm interesting, I'm rich, I'm a cool guy, I'm a smooth guy, I'm handsome, right? And then of course on the flip side, the ego can also be negative leaning, right? So the ego can also say, I'm ugly, I'm a piece of shit, I'm poor, I'm not worthy, I'm not smart, I'm dumb, I'm foolish, I'm weird, I'm awkward, right? It can it can it can bring up all these other negative ideas of ourselves, right? And this is why code approach is such a powerful tool, because if those are the thoughts that run through your mind, both positive and negative, then when you're out in the street approaching, like everything is put on the line. All of these thoughts are put on the line, and it's a very it can be a very intense process that shines a very bright light on your ego. And so now these ideas that you've put in your mind, like they're really like they literally they're grabbed and they're like squeezed and like put under a lot of pressure, because the streets don't care, right? You might think I'm this cool, handsome, suave person. I'm smart, I'm intelligent, I'm funny, I'm this, I'm that. But the streets don't care. And so your ego just gets hit, boom, boom, like time and time again, right? And on the other side, if you have the negative leaning ego that says, I'm ugly, I'm a piece of shit, then guess what happens? You go out to the streets and you get rejected. And that ego, those thoughts are confirmed, right? Those thoughts are fed. And so it makes it even worse. You feel even worse, right? And so code approach is just like a really extreme version of like battling those ego based either insecurities or these like sort of areas of our life that we think we're really good at. um and this happens with every approach, every blowout, and especially when you start, right? Because when you start code approach, like you're a beginner, and so your approach is probably going to be shit. It won't be that good. So because it's not that good, you're more likely to get unfavorable reactions. You're more likely to get the look. And I like to define this like process. Like there's the look, right? I call it the look. So we'll just call it the look. And what the look is it's it's like I mean, for me it was my biggest fear, right? But the look is essentially when you approach and you get rejected, sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes you might get a look from the girl, right? This look of, oh, who are you? Like, what are you doing? Maybe it goes even as far as like a look of disgust, as if she's saying, like, get away from me. And again, that might just be because of the quality of your approach. But the point is, it happens, right? And you get that look. And that to me is like, that the ego is hit hard when that happens, right? Because, like I said, all those negative, idealized, um, let's say, traits that you've associated with your identity, or the positive ones, they're either just like they're hit, they're exposed. You feel exposed. And it's a very vulnerable position to be in, and a very uncomfortable one as well. And so those reactions, and it can be the girl, it can also be the bystanders, it can be the strangers who are right next to you, right? They can give you that look of disapproval, like, what's this guy doing, And again, the ego is just hit, battered, bruised again and again and again when that happens. And it's not a nice feeling. It's a scary feeling. It's an uncomfortable feeling at first when you're first starting out. And so, it's also worth remembering that the ego, it's influenced by other people. So it doesn't just exist by itself. It's either stroked or bruised by other people. And so that's why again code approach is sort of a crazy tool to battle this issue, because I mean there's always going to be people around, right? Whether it's the girl herself who rejects you, or it's the people around you who might be in earshot and privy to your conversation, and they might see what goes down. And so the ego is just, it just gets hit. right? And it's based on other people, um, and how they respond to us essentially. And what's interesting is, you know, because the ego is so, let's say, brittle or um, like sensitive to people's judgment or reactions, what we tend to do is we then prefer to play it safe, right? Because the ego would rather be stroked than destroyed, right? And so, because we would rather stroke our ego, then we just put ourselves in these familiar, comfortable environments where we're never really tested. Our ego's never really stretched, right? We're never forced to challenge any of these idealized beliefs that we have about ourselves, whether they're positive or negative, right? Because remember, the ego exists to preserve itself. So the ego isn't going to encourage you to go and approach, even if you think it could benefit you in the long term, because the ego is all about short-term preservation. It's all about, how do I preserve myself right now? It's not thinking about the long-term benefit. So the ego will do whatever it can to keep itself intact in the short term. And that's so dangerous, right? And it feels safe. It feels safe. It feels good because nobody, you're not really rocked. You're sort of just coasting through life, and everything's predictable and everything's nice and dandy. Although in reality, everything isn't nice and dandy because your dating life is shit. You don't have options, or the options you have aren't to your liking. So in reality, you're not happy, but your ego is happy. Your ego, to some degree, is fine, right? Because you're not testing it. But this is why like, you have to go the opposite path. You have to go down the path of, I'm going to destroy my ego in every way possible, and I'm going to systematically break it down, chip away at it, so that I can actually get what I want. And that's how you actually grow. And for me, when it came to cold approach, you know, I remember when I first tried to go out and approach, I went to London, and I kid you not, I walked around for 2 hours and did not approach a single person. I didn't have a single conversation. And what was that? That was my ego. My ego prevented me from doing it because I didn't want to look stupid. I was too scared. I didn't want to look weird. And I got into my head. But then I remember that the week after, I said, fuck it. I cannot allow this ego to stop me from doing what I need to do. And I hope that a lot of people get to that point where they're like, you know what? Fuck it. I don't care anymore. I don't care about preserving this image. I don't care about what people think. I am just going to go and do what I want to do because I know that it's going to help me in some way at some point. And like, to me, that's the perfect way to approach it. But yeah, that's what it took. It took this sort of, let's say, godlike perspective to go above the ego, because when your ego is hit, it feels like life or death. Like, it feels really bad. In the moment, it feels rough, right? Because you feel like everything about you is being challenged, everything about you is being judged. And that's not a comfortable place to be at. It's actually a very uncomfortable place to be at. But that's why you have to rise above it and go to this like God level, even like, I would even call it like a divine plane of existence, or like frequency, where preserving your ego doesn't even matter anymore because there's something greater than that. And if you can get to that point, then that's when you really reach new heights, new levels. And I don't know what that motivating force is for, you who's watching it. I know for me, it got to a point where I was just so fed up, and I was like, I don't care anymore. I just have to do this because, sure, I could preserve my ego, but then I'll go back home and I'll just feel like shit. And I was just tired of feeling bad. I was tired of feeling incompetent. I was tired of feeling like a pussy. And I thrive off that idea of just like being a pussy. Like, if I'm with my friend, and you know we're both sort of daring each other to do something. If I chicken out and then he goes, bro, you're being a pussy, then to me that will, 9 times out of 10, that will spur me into action. That will force me to do something. So I think that's been really helpful. like a very helpful mental frame to view cold approach through as a guy. It's like it's either I fall in line and preserve my ego, or I stop being a pussy and I just go for it. And that's really just pushed me to going for these approaches, especially at the beginning. And so my message to anybody who wants to either start or can, but yeah, I guess to be fair, this is more directed to people who haven't done an approach yet. If you haven't started, then try as much as you can to put your ego aside, and maybe that means doing stuff that isn't necessarily related to cold approach, but it just puts your ego aside and forces you to sort of like bear your cross, right? Be be someone who just doesn't care. Develop this carefree attitude where your ego is like it's a side thought. It doesn't really matter to you anymore, and all you care about is growth. All you care about is just smashing through your fears. Because of course your ego is also tied to your fears, right? And fear is like a very powerful force that just keeps us like paralyzed. But fear can also push you in the right direction if it's the right fear. Because like I said, to me the fear of being a pussy is actually pretty strong. Like I don't like that idea. So I sometimes try to use that to just overcome any um, reservations I have about anything, especially when it came to cold approach. So so yeah, that's essentially like my thoughts on ego. So yeah, cold approach is the final boss of ego death, yeah. And what's incredible is you'll come out the other end a complete weapon, yeah. Because if your ego no longer holds you back, then what can hold you back? Because like I said, your ego is tied. Your ego is tied to the opinions of other people, because the opinions of other people either confirm or or reduce or let's say your yeah. So it's like let me take a step back. So your ego is either confirmed by the opinions of others, or it's either like basically destroyed by the opinions of others. So like if I think I'm a cool person and then somebody tells me I'm not cool, or they give me a look that suggests that I'm not actually as cool as I think I am, then that destroys this perception I have of myself, of my identity that I'm this cool guy. And then on the other hand, if I think I'm a piece of shit, and then somebody gives me a look that confirms that I'm a piece of shit, then now it's confirmed that I'm a piece of shit and I feel terrible. But imagine you get to a point where in either scenario, you just don't care about whatever they think, positive or negative, right? Like if you've been through so many ego destroying activities or ego destroying experiences, then at the end of the day you realize none of it matters and you can just do whatever you want. You can be whoever you want. You can fail as much as you want. You can look stupid, you can look awkward, you can sound weird, you can look weird as much as you want, because you truly, at your core, you don't give a fuck. And to me, like, that is when you actually start living your life properly. When you wake up and you're like, I don't really care too much about other people's negative opinions. Because the positive ones, we all love that. Nobody has an issue with that. When people are giving us our praises, our ego loves it, right? It's the negative opinions that stop us from doing what we want to do. And so with cold approach, it's even worse because there's so much shame attached to expressing our desires. And again, our ego wants to fit within society, and society says men should be like this, and you should be a good little boy, and don't rock the boat, and just go by the book. Don't put your head above the parapet. Just fall in line, boy. Just fall in line. But if you do something like cold approach, very quickly you realize, nah, I don't really subscribe to that anymore. I don't want to live that kind of life. Yeah, you become this, like, again, Christian says, zero fucks given attitude, right? You just don't care anymore. You become this like rebel, and it's such a great place to be. And I'm not saying you become obnoxious or you become disrespectful, or you get to a point where you don't care about anyone. Of course, there's limits, but there's so much growth in this journey, because you realize that a lot of the stuff that's prevented you from taking action, it's all just bullshit. It's all been given to you by society, and the quicker you can let go of those, let's say, self-limiting societal constraints, then you can change who you are very dramatically, very quickly. And like I said, you'll wake up a completely different person. You know, now you'll just say what's on your mind. Now you'll go after what you want because the ego doesn't stop you from doing that. And it's I called it like a sort of like a god level frequency, because what ends up happening is you rise above all those, let's say, ceilings, and you enter this other world in your mind, and it's a very powerful, very very powerful place to be, because then at that point, if you really think about it, you become unstoppable. And it's crazy to think that that's how you can feel when, maybe like for me personally, I feel somewhat unstoppable. Not in the sense that life can't humble me, because life will probably humble me at some point, and I still have so much growth to experience. But what I mean by that is just when it comes to pursuing my desires and trying to get after what I want, I really feel as if nobody can tell me otherwise. You know, ultimately, if I really want to do something now and I feel like it comes from like deep from my sort of core desire and heart, then I'll go for it. And the opinions of other people, it will take a lot for that to stop me from doing what I want to do. And that's what Code Approach did. The reason I'm at that point right now is because of Code Approach. So it's it's a powerful process, and it will be it'll be a very important journey for anybody embarking on it. If you want to get to a point where you just don't care, and the point where your ego is it loses its steam. So yeah, that's pretty much it for that stream. This will be a shorter one, but I just felt inspired to talk about that particular topic. So yeah, I mean, there's nobody in the nobody is watching at the moment, but it's cool. It is what it is. Um, but yeah, that was it. So yes, until next time, boys. Otherwise, I hope you're approaching. Don't let your ego stop you. Go after it. Peace out.